So in May, I've gotten myself into a little bit of a pickle, and I feel like I'm going to be spending June trying to claw myself out of this hole that I have somehow dug myself into. So going into May, I knew I wasn't going to read a lot. I had a lot of plans, I've been on holiday, and I just knew that reading wasn't going to be a priority. But what I didn't anticipate is how little I was actually going to read. So it's very, you are watching this a few days early if you're watching it when it's posted. It's being filmed a few days early, but no matter when I'd have filmed this, the outcome, like, I don't really feel like I would have made much of a dent in my currently reading or my TBR. So I've essentially in May, I've read nothing that was actually on my May TBR. I've only read 3 books, and the longest of those books was 315 pages. And as you know, my TBR was actually full of a lot of like 500, 600 page books. I'm currently reading 4 books, which is very unusual for me. That's not something I do. I'm very much a 2 book at once max person, but I tend to just like read 1 book, finish it, pick up a new book. So now that I've got all of these current reads, I don't really know what to do with them. And I'm adding, I think, 2, 3, 6 books to my, so this TBR is essentially all of May's TBR and then 6 brand new books, because we have 2 brand new book club books to add, my Patreon pick for June, a buddy read, and 2 books that actually they don't need to be on this TBR because I don't have to read them. It's just 2 books that I picked up recently that I'm in the mood for, so I kind of wanted to say like, hey, really interested in these books. If I possibly could read them in June, I would love to, but realistically, I've read 13, because I think that's how many books we've got. I've read 13 books in a month, maybe twice in the history of my YouTube channel. So it's not likely I'm gonna get to those, but I mean, we'll stick them on here anyway and we'll see how it goes. So I'm gonna be running through the books that were on last month's TBR pretty, well, not rapid fire because I don't do rapid fire, but I'll just tell you kind of like how far I am into them, because you have seen them before, and also a couple of them were also brought from like April's TBR into May. But I will kick off with the current reads, the first one of which is of course the Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan. And while I am super behind on my actual TBR, I'm happy to say that I'm not behind on the 2 big read-alongs that I've committed to this year, because that's important. Like, even if I fall behind on everything else, I have to stay on track with these, because I feel like when I start to slip with this, there's no clawing my way back. And so I'm reading this for the Wheel of Time along, which I'm a co-host of, which was created by Sandra from Got a Thing for Things. And the live show for the Dragon Reborn is actually going to be on the 4th of June at 9 PM BST on Mel from Mel or Not Read's channel. So if I read 54 pages a day of this, I will be done in time for the live show. So I'm currently on page 218. At the time of filming this, I still have a good, I want to say 7-8 days until the live show. So providing I keep up with my 54 pages a day, it's going to be plain sailing. This one I did pick up right at the beginning of the month, and I got 30 pages into it and I put it down because I was very much in the headspace of preparing to go on holiday, preparing all of my content so there wouldn't be a gap in my schedule for you guys. And I just wasn't in the headspace after sorting all of that out to then pick up something that's like quite so slow and not necessarily dense, but it is very slow moving, so it's not the most captivating read. However, since coming back and picking this back up, once I got past the first 50 pages or so, I'm actually enjoying this a little bit more. I like the perspectives that we're getting in this book. It's still not perfect, but I'm having a decent time with it. So this one, I'm anticipating like I'm going to finish this on the 4th of June. If I manage to finish any of my current reads before the end of May, it's going to be Blood Solace by Vila Roth. So this one is for my Patreon book club. It's the April and May book, which is a fantasy romance book club where we read full series. This one is like an adult political fantasy romance, and it has a very formal writing style, which is the thing that's kind of holding me back with it. Like, it's very formal and also like quite, I want to say, historical. It reminds me of like proper court etiquette and that kind of tone. So while I mean, it's a chunky book. It's 580 pages. I'm on page 190. If I can manage to get some decent reading time in before the end of the month, this should be done, but it's not the fastest read, so I can't guarantee it. But this, once again, I struggled through the first 100 pages, like with Wheel of Time and like with book 1 in this series. But now that I'm past that, I'm into it a lot more. So, I mean, we have hope, but it could still potentially end up on my June TBR. On the flight to New York, I started Iron Gold by P.S. Brown, which is a 5-star prediction for me. And and the 55 pages I read of this were very, very good. But when I read this series, I go down a very immersive route because the audiobook narration is phenomenal. So I listen to the audiobook and read along at the same time. So when I was on my way to New York, that was great because I was looking for something really immersive and engaging to help me pass the time. But on the way back, that really wasn't the case. I was exhausted and I just wanted something that was a little less effort than like plugging into an audiobook and reading along at the same time without going just one of those routes and kind of sacrificing my reading experience of like one of my favorite series ever. So I decided to pick up like a non-fiction that was a much easier read instead. And as I mentioned, I'm not very good at juggling multiple books at once. So now that I'm home, I just don't know what book to pick up at any point. So I haven't continued on with this yet, but I think this is going to be my first, like I don't think I'm going to read much, if any, of this in the rest of May, but this is 100% then going to be my first priority for June because I'm desperate to get back into this. The end of the prologue of this, phenomenal, and I've enjoyed so little recently that I'm very hyped to get back into something that I feel I'm guaranteed to love. And then the final book that I'm currently into, I've barely started this. I'm 18 pages into it and I recently did a 24-hour readathon that I do every month. Depending on what tier you're on, it's bi-monthly, but there is a 24-hour readathon on my Patreon every month, and this month the prompt was poll pick. So this one was selected for me by my patrons. It is something that was off my TBR though, only 18 pages in, and that is Gwen and Art Are Not in Love by Lex Croucher. This one is a art copy that was sent to me by Bloomsbury. The publication date is in May, which means it's important to me obviously that I prioritize it for this month. But I started this very close to the end of the 24-hour readathon, so I only got a few pages into it. But this one I do think is going to be a pretty quick read when I do sink into it. So it's not like I'm not worried about it, even though it's not the smallest book. I just haven't dedicated or had the chance to dedicate much time to it in May. So those are all of my current reads. The two books that I'm pulling over from my May TBR that I haven't yet started are my Patreon picks for April and May. I am so behind, but it's fine. But the one from April is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. This one I believe was Bex's pick, and this one is like a paranormal story that has some historical elements, I believe, in book 2, about a woman who attends Oxford potentially and finds some sort of like manuscript that alludes to a world of witches, demons and vampires. I've heard very, very good things about this series, and I've also heard that the audiobook for this is really good, which may come in handy. At the end of this video, I guess I'll talk a little bit about like what my general plans are for June, because I didn't do that at the beginning like I usually do. But audiobooks may come in handy for me at a certain point in June, so I'm definitely going to be bearing that in mind. And then my second Patreon pick, the one for May, is Brandy's pick, which is The Demon King by Cinda Williams Chimer. This is book 1 in the Seven Realms trilogy, a series that I've been really excited to get to for a very long time. The only thing that's worrying me about this is that it is YA, and I'm concerned that kind of like I've missed my window for this, but I have heard really good things, so I have high hope. It's a YA high fantasy. It has like wizards, princesses, and all of that like good high fantasy stuff. So I feel like I'm gonna have a good time with this one. Fingers crossed, because like I really have wanted to read that for a while, and it would be a real shame if I've kind of like missed that window of opportunity on that series. So now going into the new additions to my June TBR, I feel like a good place to start would be my Patreon pick for June, as I've just gone through the Patreon picks for earlier months that I haven't yet read. But if you're in the inner circle tier of my Patreon, you can recommend a book that goes into this jar that I have solid intentions to read but often fall behind on. So this is actually going to get a reshuffle after I've picked the June book, because every 6 months anybody who's had their books picked has the opportunity to like put a new one in. But I have tipped everything out and reshuffled, as I do pretty frequently. And let's see what this month's book is going to be. I'm hoping for something manageable to make this TBR a little bit less intimidating. So I'm probably gonna pull out, oops, The Name of the Wind or something ridiculous. So this one is purple, which means it was added this year. This is Edge of Collapse by Kyla Stone, and it's Debbie's pick. Where is my phone? So this one is this a thriller? Is it like it's a dystopian potentially? And potentially also a romance? What's the average rating on this? The average rating is 4.2, which I feel is decent. It is all of those things that I just said, I think. So in the dead of winter, an EMP attack destroys the US power grid. So our main character, who has been held captive for the last 5 years by a sadistic psychopath, has the lock on her cage released by this EMP. So she escapes and she finds a reclusive ex-soldier called Liam, who thought he was prepared for any disaster until the EMP took everything he'd ever cared about in a matter of seconds. They are trying to get to rural Michigan, but obviously without any power they have to walk there. And we have the cold, like this winter apocalypse setting, and also the fact that the person who had the main character captive is also stalking them and they have to walk 200 miles. So it says it's a survival thriller, but I feel like we definitely have like an element of dystopia here, and also potentially I feel a romance between the girl who's been held captive and this soldier that's going to be going to Michigan with her. So definitely not something I would pick up on my own, but something that just sounds interesting. And actually with me feeling not necessarily, I have been feeling a little bit slumpy, but also with me struggling to read the books on my TBR recently, I've been craving things like thrillers and horrors that are outside of my comfort zone, which is how I ended up reading a non-fiction on the way back from New York, because I feel like it's sometimes easier for me to sink into genres that I'm not familiar with when I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed or stressed or not wanting to invest like a whole ton of brain power in a book. So thank you very much to Debbie for that, and I'll have to see if I can get this on like KU or Scribd or something, and if not I'll just buy a copy. So I then have 2 book club books that I need to read. The first one is of course The Last Argument of Kings by Jo Abercrombie. This one is the catch-up book club pick, which is my book club for the months of May and June. The live show for this is going to be in July, although I do have a couple of things going on early July, so it might be a little bit later in the month than usual. But this one is the final book in the First Law trilogy, which is a very slow-moving, political and character-driven series where we are predominantly following a torturer, a northern barbarian, and a fencing champion and member of the nobility as they get wrapped up in this plot that involves pretty much the entire country going to war, and also the magical history of the world, the main players, like the immortals in that magical history, and I feel like a cyclical struggle where everything's happening over and over again and everything very much ties into the past and how all of that stuff is like resurfacing in the present. That is a very vague synopsis, but this is a series that doesn't have I would say a plot in the traditional sense. It's very much you're following these characters as they're swept along by things that are outside of their control and things that are being manipulated by potentially the supporting characters. It's a grimdark series. There's a lot of grey morality in here. I would say that none of the characters we're following are heroes. While they may potentially do heroic things occasionally, and it's not often they do, they all are very, very deeply flawed, which is something that I particularly enjoy about this series. This one I'm very excited to dive into because I feel like I said, that there's very much like a lack of plot in the traditional sense. I feel like this is one of the series where you don't really know where it's going while you're reading it, but when you get to the end, like, I have a strong feeling I'm gonna look back on the trilogy and be like, oh my god, that was genius. So I'm really hoping that Jo Abercrombie pulls through for me. This one is a chunky one though. It's almost 700 pages, going on an already incredibly large TBR. For my Patreon book club, I'm going to be picking up the 3rd book in the Blood Grace series, which is Blood Sanctuary by Vila Roth. This is just the book for June, so I definitely want to make sure that I get to it because this one is under 500 pages. It is 440, so it should be manageable, a lot more manageable than the first 2 books in this series. I will give you a little bit of a synopsis because I didn't earlier, but this one is an adult like political fantasy romance following the bastard daughter of the king of the human realm, or like one of the human lands, and a emissary from the Hesperines. Now the Hesperines are a vampiric race and they come to the city or the country that Cassia's father rules over because they're renegotiating a peace treaty that has lapsed like hundreds of years, thousands of years ago potentially. This treaty was put in place that decreed peace between like the humans and the Hesperines, and in the last couple of 100 years it's lapsed. So the king has invited the Hesperines to renegotiate this treaty, and Cassia has maneuvered herself into a position to be able to meet one of them because she has some things that she would like to ask them. So she ends up in touch with Leo, and the majority of the first book is told in a series of conversations conversations that they have every night. Like I said, very slow moving, very formal writing style. So every time I pick up one of these books, it takes me a little while to get myself situated. But I really liked how the first book ended. Like I said, with book 2, I'm currently at a place where it's getting interesting, and I've heard very good things about this series as a whole. I am glad that this one's a little bit shorter though, even though that means it'll still work out the same because I then have another 400-page installment to read in July, so it'll end up actually being about the same across the 2 months, but it just feels a little bit more manageable, you know? And this was actually a gift from Amanda for my birthday as well, so thank you very much to Amanda for sending this one my way. The arc that I have to read, well, I don't have to read, it's only released in July, but I tend to put them on the TBR of the month before they're released because I do have a habit of falling behind, so then at least I'll get this read in July if it doesn't make it in June. But that one is the Pomegranate Gate by Ariel Kaplan, which was sent to me by Solaris, and is it Rebellion Publishing? Yes, to review on my channel, so thank you very much for sending this my way. This is a book that could go either way for me. It's not something that I feel like falls into my usual, oh my god, I want to read this category, but it does sound very similar to books that I've previously been a little bit unsure about that I've ended up giving 5 stars to. So this one is a historical fantasy that very much seems to be in the same vein of things like the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden, Gods of Journey Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and the one that I read recently, The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea, which I always forget the title of. But essentially I don't like historical things very much, but I've discovered that in some cases historical fantasies can really work for me if they have, it tends to be if they have a romantic plot line and if they lean into like fairy tales and folklore, which with historical fantasy it does tend to. This one in particular is based on or inspired by Jewish fairy tales and is set in 15th century Spain. I believe that the catalyst for this is that the Queen orders all Jews within the city to either leave or convert, and that means that our 2 main characters have to flee. There is a pomegranate gate in here that the book is named after, which seems to be like a gate between worlds, and they end up separated from their traveling companions, and I believe that they find each other and then have to kind of like flee together. That is just like a very bare bones kind of grasp that I've got from the press release, but for me it's definitely the Jewish fairy tales and the backdrop of 15th century Spain that has me interested in this, so hopefully it does end up being a hit. It has it's not the smallest and it has very small text as well, but like I said, if I don't get to this in June, I do still have July as well because the release date on this is the 20th of July. The buddy read that I have lined up for June very much depends on whether the book arrives to me because I've ordered the Goldsboro edition. It has just been released, but Goldsboro tend to be like a little bit late with the actual delivery of the books. But that is the Battle Drum by Sarah El-Arifi, which I will be reading with Aaron. We read the first book in the series, which was, why can't I remember, The Final Strife, which was a book that it's one of the best Goldsboro books that I've read that I got from the subscription, although it did have a little bit of an issue with fat phobia for me, but it's like an adult high fantasy that's set in a world where everybody's separated by the colour of their blood. There's a rebellion in this world, and however many years before the start of the story there were children that were swapped, which resulted in red bloods being hidden among the blue bloods, which are like the working class. The idea with the rebellion was that there would be red-blooded children raised among the blue bloods so that they could see the injustice and the oppression that the lower blooded classes were facing, so that eventually they could enter these children into the tournament that happens every so many years to pick like the next leaders of the country, and they would obviously have the ability to be entered into this because their blood would be the right color, and then they would have the power to change like the system. I really enjoyed the first book, and I also am really interested in where the end of book 1 left off. So I'm really excited to get into book 2 when it arrives. And then the final 2 books I'm going to be talking about, I hope there's nothing I've forgotten about, but these are 2 books that I've picked up recently when I was in New York that I really want to read. One because the author's at Rare, the other one just because I really want to. Realistically, I'm aware I'm not going to be reading these books in June, but a girl can dream. So the first one is the ever-hyped Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I was interested in reading this just generally because it's come out of nowhere and everyone's obsessed with it, but I decided that because I like a souvenir book from every trip. Granted, from New York I picked up more souvenir books than I should have, but the one that I went to New York actually looking for was Fourth Wing because it had the sprayed stenciled edges on the first edition hardback. This one I actually don't know anything about. I believe that it's romantasy. Are you quite finished? I believe that it is set in some sort of dragon riding school. That's all I know, but it's got very good reviews and I'm interested to see whether it actually lives up to the hype. I'm dubious, but the more reviews I hear, the more likely it seems that I'm also going to enjoy this, but the hype on this is wild. And the other one is another hyped book that I didn't want this book. Everybody's been reading this book and loving this book, and I was just kind of really not interested until I think I saw Cody's review. And I was like, you know what? I am going to pick this book up. And the interesting thing is that I always would have been interested in this book. This has always sounded like something that I would give 5 stars to, but for some reason I was just disinterested. But this is the backup book, the book that I was going to pick up from the US if I couldn't get Fourth Wing. But when I went to the Strand, I saw that they had a signed edition, so it felt like kind of a sign, and I picked it up anyway. But that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This one is a little bit of a sci-fi. It's about 2 friends that work in the video game industry, and I think Cody said it's not a love story, like it's not a romance, but it is about love. And I feel like this is going to have the most beautiful bittersweet ending, and I love pain. I love a book that leaves me feeling hollow, and I feel like this is going to be the one. And also, like, is it sci-fi or is it just like in tech? Do they just work in tech? Yeah, it doesn't seem that it is actually sci-fi. It just seems like they work in the video game industry, which still absolutely up my alley. And it seems like it has a kind of like one day or people we meet on vacation kind of vibe. More one day, I guess, than people we meet on vacation. But everything about it sounds like something I'd enjoy, and I knew kind of like the bare bones of what it was about, like I do now, but for some reason I decided it wasn't for me, and that actually baffles me because I think I'm really gonna love this. So if I get time, Fourth Wing and Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I can't lift this, I'm gonna have to reorder it. This is actually obscene. I can't believe we've done this. So we still have the Battle Drum to add to this, which ain't small, and The Edge of Collapse by Kyla Stone, which is my June Patreon pick. This is ridiculous. This is beyond undoable. I know for sure I'll be lucky if I even manage to accomplish the me TBR portion of this stack, but a girl can dream. In June as well, I thought I didn't have very many plans. I actually do have like a few things dotted around. I have friends coming to visit for a weekend. I have one concert that I'm going to in Manchester, which is for Curtis's benefit. It's somebody that he wants to see, but that is happening, so I'm going to be in Manchester for a day. And most importantly, the thing that's going to take me from reading the most is that I'm getting eye surgery in June. So on the 14th of June, I will be getting eye surgery, which is why I said the audiobooks I feel will very much come in handy, because I've given myself, like, I've cleared my schedule for the 2 days after that to essentially stay away from screens and not do anything that will potentially strain my eyes while I recover in the first couple of days following that. So yeah, that's going to be hard for me as well, because I'm very much a person who needs to be doing something that occupies my brain and my like hands at the same time. So having to solely pretty much listen to audiobooks is going to be rough, but at least it's only a couple of days. The recovery is super quick. So yeah guys, that was my June TBR. Please let me know down in the comments what book you're most excited to get to in June, and also let me know how ridiculous you think my TBR is, because it truly is. But here we are. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. You head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.